So the first thing I want to talk about is a phenomenon that I'm studying and I talk about in my book. I've called it connected consumption. It's also been called collaborative consumption, but it's a range of new ways of meeting consumer needs that are more time intensive, because clearly they're geared to this new time affluent lifestyle. They cost much less, so they are time intensive, money unintensive, and they build social capital. And some of these innovations that I'm going to talk about also turn out to be income earning opportunities. So the first one I've got here is called Free Cycle. Do you have Free Cycle chapters here in Germany? Free Cycle is an online community. You join it on a neighborhood basis, and people give things away in that community. So if you have something you don't want, you make it available to the community. If you have something you need, you go to the site and find it. It's a kind of eBay style, Craigslist, so it's an internet-enabled gift economy. This is only one of many, many new innovations of goods exchange which have developed in what some people are also calling the sharing economy. What is the fastest growing form of transportation in the world? It turns out to be bike sharing. But there's car sharing. In the United States, we have a company called Zipcar. It was car sharing. The title for car sharing came actually from Berlin. Someone who teaches at a university near me saw a car sharing innovation here in Berlin and went home and told a friend of hers in Cambridge about it, and she started Zipcar, which is a very, very popular, rapidly growing car sharing kind of site where you sign up and become a member, and then you can borrow a car for a fixed amount. There are tool libraries, and this is a very low-tech example, something called couch surfing, where people go and instead of going to a hotel, they go and stay on someone's couch, and people travel all around the world on these couches. The people who own the couches get a little bit of money for it. The people who rent out the couches pay a lot less than they would for a hotel, and social capital is created through these things. So these are just some examples. Now, why is this important? One of the reasons is that many of these innovations, and we're talking here about cars and living spaces and transportation and clothing, and I'll give you some more examples in a minute, are part of a consumption regime which has become materially extremely, extremely intensive. That is very high material throughput to maintain our consumer regime. That's the flip side of saying what I said at the beginning of my talk, which is that we have an economy which is pushing up against the boundaries of the planet ecologically. So we're putting a lot of ecological pressure on. Each of these rucksacks represents 15 kgs of resource consumption per day per person in these countries. And one of the things you can see is that there are certain parts of the world, like Africa, which have 10 kgs of consumption per capita per day. The United States, which usually is at the very top of the list in terms of resource consumption, has 88, so roughly 9 times. The average American is consuming roughly 9 times in the actual weight, material weight of their daily consumption. That's what this is measuring. Than the average African, 14 per day for the average Asian. Europe is about half of the US at 43, and that's pretty consistent across eco-footprint, carbon footprint, and so forth. Europe is about half the US at a roughly comparable standard of living, grosso, in gross terms. But this is consumption which is not coming down. So looking back over the last 25 years, on a global basis, material consumption is increasing, so total material throughput and pressure on ecosystems is increasing. And despite all that technological innovation, the average person is consuming on a daily basis on a global scale as much as he or she was 25 years ago. So we need to do something about that. I've looked at this problem from another perspective. The material throughput data that I just showed you looks at it from the perspective of the production side. But I've also said, well, what's happening on the consumer side? How are people experiencing that? And by the way, if you talk to consumers about, in the United States certainly, about the level of material, the material weights of their consumption, they are in absolute disbelief about the fact that they consume, in the US, about 88 kilograms a day of weight. And they don't believe you. And they just absolutely discount it, can't be true, et cetera, et cetera. When you talk to them about the products that they're consuming, they can understand the problem of excessive material throughput. And one of the ways they can, and I think the easiest way, entry point for this, in my experience, has been to talk to people about clothing. And here's a picture of a teenage girl in the United States, and she may be a little bit extreme, but I'm not sure you can see it so well. But this is her bedroom, and she's looking for something to wear in the morning, and she has, probably 1,000, if not more, pieces of clothing in there. I measured the amount of clothing that people are buying in the United States over the period 1991 to 2007. And what happened is more than a doubling of the number of pieces purchased per year per person. In 1991, the average American purchased 34 new pieces of apparel a year. That doesn't include socks and hosiery, but it includes dresses and shirts and pants and sweaters and so forth. 34 in 1991. By 2007, the average person was purchasing 67 new pieces of apparel per year. That's more than one every week. I forget, every 5.3 days, a new piece of apparel. Now, I have a little model that shows, most of this is imported. By the end of this period, almost 100% of American apparel purchases are imports. That the more imports in the US, the more we import clothing, the more we export used clothing. And so the second side of this was a massive outpouring of used clothing which went around the world, mostly to low-income areas of the world. A lot went to Africa, Southeast Asia, and so forth. You can go to places all over the world today and see people wearing the used clothes of Americans, and I think less so of Europeans, but there's some of that. So we were on what I called a fashion cycle, acquire and discard, and that sped up very, very dramatically. This is only the tip of the iceberg. Most of the clothes that gets discarded don't get shipped out. A lot go into the waste stream, some of them go to thrift shops, a lot of them get cut up to be things like the seats that you're sitting on. There may be used clothing in there. By the end of the 1990s, this process had become so widespread and so large that you could hardly give used clothing away in the US. There were just literally mountains and mountains and mountains of used clothing accumulating. At one place near where I live, they would sell it by the pound. At the time I started doing this research 10 years ago, it was $1 a pound. Since the recession, of course, the supply decreases and the demand increases, the price has gone up to $1.50 a pound. But this is a place where you can go and get perfectly good used clothing, even some things that are brand new or have barely been worn, cheaper than you can buy rice and beans or the most basic food commodities. And that is historically absolutely mind-boggling. It's completely unprecedented historically that apparel would be so cheap, because historically apparel has been a very, very expensive product. It's been expensive because it uses a lot of resources to produce the fibers, and it uses a lot of human labor to produce the garments. So it's a very resource-intensive good, and historically it has had a lot of value. So very interestingly, in Europe, even into the 20th century, used apparel was a secondary, what we call a secondary currency. So for people who didn't have enough coins or paper currency, they used their used clothing to get money. They would take it to a pawn dealer, but there were people who specialized in clothing resale. That tells you how valuable it is. I mean, it has to be that valuable to serve as a currency. We now have an economic system for two major reasons. One is we're not paying the ecological costs, and the other, with apparel, we're not paying the human costs, because the wages of apparel workers and the conditions of apparel workers have been degraded back to what was going on in the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So the absolute global degradation of conditions of work for apparel. And those two things together have made apparel so artificially cheap that we could take this, something which is effectively as valuable as a currency and turn it into a worthless good after being worn once, twice, a little bit. It's a completely dysfunctional global economy, and it is not a surprise that it is creating huge numbers of huge ecological impacts, but also a very distorted labor market and human impacts. Well, part of what's happening then, and by the way, I started with apparel and then I started studying this process in lots of other items, and the same thing went on in furniture, in shoes, in household goods, in consumer electronics. Think about the acquisition and discard of consumer electronics. In the US, people hold the cell phones for 18 months, the computers for 2 years. So very rapid and increasing cycle of acquisition and discard. Across the consumer landscape, you had this same phenomenon going on. So the connected consumption or the sharing or collaborative consumption regime is moving away from that. It's reversing that tremendous increase in the material throughput through the consumption economy. There's a company called ThredUp, which says you don't wear 25% of the clothes in your closet, so what can you do with them? You join ThredUp, you put them in these envelopes. This is an American, Netflix is do you have Netflix here? It's for DVDs going through, rental of DVDs through the mail. You put it in an envelope and you send it back. This is what's happening with clothing. You take the clothes you no longer want, you put them in the envelope, you send them, you get an envelope of new clothes, new to you, as they call it, somebody else's used clothing. People are organizing swaps all around the country at different kinds of swaps. Some of them are high-end. The one on the bottom here is people who live in Palm Beach, which is a fancy place in Florida, and they buy designer clothes, and they swap them out. And the one at the top is homey-grown, more mid-level. So the idea is that we are moving to a sharing economy, not just in content, which is where it started. We're very familiar with sharing content on the web, right? With sharing videos and sharing music and sharing blogs and writing and books and all of that. We are moving into the equivalent of that sharing economy for stuff, for material goods, not just for cultural content. And there's a lot of interesting innovation going on with food, and this is an example of a soup swap. People make one type of soup, and they make a lot of it, and they get together with their neighbors and friends, and they swap out, because you can put soup in the freezer and save it. But we've got all kinds of swaps going on where people's goods and labor are being exchanged. And another example is the Time Banks, which is again, an internet platform where people trade skills. And there's a huge number of new startups, both profit and nonprofit and sort of in-betweens, that are starting in this whole area. Specialized goods exchange, specialized skills exchange, exchange skill for skill, service for service, exchange money for service. There are new currencies that are being developed. There are financial sites which are doing something similar. It's across the whole range. A lot of them are going to fail, but a lot of them are going to succeed, I think. What are the economics of this? One is that the recession has been really important in accelerating it, because what a stagnant economy means is that people have more money, less money and more time than they did in a boom economy. And although the internet dramatically reduces the transactions costs of these innovations, they are more time intensive and you need less money to do them, which is part of why I started this whole part of my talk by saying this is a solution for creating a highly valuable, a high satisfaction lifestyle in a period when income is not growing. So the transactions costs are reduced. People have excess capacity in their consumer goods and services. They're renting those couches, they're renting rooms in their home. They are creating, if they have a garden and they have more tomatoes that they need, they barter them out with somebody and so forth. So people have what we call excess capacity, both in their goods and services and also in time. There's one last point I want to make before stopping, and then we'll get on to the questions, and that is, I've been talking mostly about exchanges of goods, but I think that to be successful, a short hours economy also has to create a pathway for people to become producers in a different way. And I used a term which was developed by a German philosopher named Fritjof Bergmann, who has lived mostly in the United States as an adult. And he called it high-tech self-providing or high-tech self-provisioning. But the point is that in that free time, people also make and do more for themselves. And we are seeing a huge explosion of this in the United States. It came out of the sustainability movement, but the recession has also accelerated it, because people have time on their hands and they don't have as much money. So in addition to participating in all of these kinds of innovations that I just talked about, people are also making and doing more for themselves. The areas they're doing it in are food, in housing, so there's more home construction going on, do it yourself, in the microgeneration of energy, of course, and in these, this is a much smaller niche area, but I think you may have some of it going on here. Small-scale manufacturing using computer-controlled, what are called fabrication laboratory, fab lab technologies, which allow you to make lots of manufactured goods with very little cost. What's important about, and here's a picture of permaculture, for example, which is the movement within agriculture. Here are these fab lab machines. I'd be glad to talk to you more about them. What's really important about this is two things. One is it creates a much more productive way of using that time that gets freed up from the labor market than what we have been doing recently, because it allows people to produce things for themselves which they need and replace things that they would have purchased. It is small scale. It has very low financial barriers to entry, so almost all of these things that I'm talking about require very little capital to get going. The reason it's called high-tech self-providing is that many of these innovations rely on high levels of what I call ecological knowledge. So permaculture basically is an agricultural approach that relies on a lot of ecological knowledge. Rather than using a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, chemicals, you use smarts to replicate nature. And a number of these innovations require that high level of ecological knowledge. It's a new form of knowledge that we're developing. I mean, a lot of the really interesting stuff has come out of Germany. But what it means is that you can be much more productive in any hour of time than if you're just using old-fashioned methods, which in the past have been very labor-intensive and low productivity. Computerization has made it possible to really dramatically increase the productivity of the small scale. And that means also the productivity of the household and the individual. And this creates a pathway for a number of things, for more financial independence for people, for more ability to self-provide in a high productivity way, and also, one of the things we're seeing with a lot of the people who are doing this, and this is the third major pillar of the plenitude economy with time use, a new consumer sector, and high-tech self-providing, is that they are turning these skills that they learn into jobs and careers and incubating new small-scale green businesses, which I believe are going to be really important in the growth of a green ecological sector. So I think it's a smart kind of economics. It's not just something that I or others think we should do because we like the eco-impact of it. It also makes sense from a variety of ways. And the last thing here, if you can see it, is this build social capital, because many of these innovations involve much denser social ties and more community. It's a very optimistic vision. It's one which, to answer one of the questions of this conference, is an answer to what can we do now when the global processes for solving ecological collapse have collapsed themselves. How do you get going as an individual, as a household, as a city, as a province, at a local level? How do you get going? You start to build the new ways of living, the new consumption regime, new innovation at a small scale, and eventually start to scale up. And that is, I think, one of the things that's happening. The recession has been very painful in the United States, but I would say the one really wonderful thing to have come out of it is the growth of all of these kinds of changes that I've been talking about. Thank you.